Picture a fighter bearing down on you at several hundred miles per hour, closing fast with terrifying precision. Your eyes lock onto the nose of the aircraft. Right at the center, a hypnotic spiral spins so fast, it seems to pull you in. Before you can think clearly, it is already almost too late. That painted swirl did far more than simply decorate a warplane. It played on human psychology, kept ground crews alive, and became one of the most recognizable symbols of aerial warfare in history. This is the story of why the Luftwaffe chose that unmistakable pattern, and why the decision was far more calculated than it first appears. German aircraft of the Second World War carried a visual identity, unlike any other air force of the era. The sleek Bf 109, the brutal Fw 190, and the science-fictional Me 262 jet all contributed to a distinctive Luftwaffe aesthetic. Among all these visual details, the painted propeller spiral stood apart as something genuinely unusual among the world's air forces. Allied air forces did not use it. The Royal Air Force kept its spinners in solid colors, clean and unmarked. The United States Army Air Force did the same, preferring clean reds or plain silvers on their propeller hubs. The swirling two-tone pattern was largely a German choice, and it was not made by accident or whim. The most immediate reason behind the spiral was intimidation. The logic behind it was direct and coldly effective. When the propeller turned at full speed, the pattern dissolved into a churning optical illusion, making the aircraft look alive. German military culture of that period placed enormous value on the spectacle of power and the weaponization of fear. Fear was considered a legitimate tactical weapon, and the dizzying spiral at the nose was designed to unsettle enemies. Allied pilots who survived head-on engagements later described the psychological effect of the spiral as genuinely unnerving. At closing speeds, where a pilot had only fractions of a second to react, even the smallest distraction carried deadly consequences. The spiral was engineered to provide exactly that distraction at the worst possible moment for an opposing pilot. Beyond psychology, there was a thoroughly practical reason for the design that had nothing to do with combat at all. Wartime airfields were chaotic, noisy environments, crowded with machinery and personnel working under enormous pressure. Aircraft piston engines of the era produced tremendous noise, making it dangerously easy to misjudge whether a propeller was moving. A spinning propeller under certain lighting conditions is nearly invisible, and the consequences of walking into one were fatal. The two-tone contrasting spiral made propeller movement immediately visible from a great distance across a busy airfield. It transformed an invisible hazard into an obvious warning, saving the lives of mechanics and ground crew daily. For that safety reason alone, the spiral would have justified its existence, even if it never unsettled a single enemy pilot. Military historians have also pointed to subtler effects the spiral may have produced during actual aerial combat engagements. A theory holds that the rotating pattern created genuine confusion in enemy depth perception during high-speed encounters. The approaching aircraft appeared closer, larger, or faster than it actually was, thanks to the visual disruption of the swirl. Anti-aircraft gunners and opposing pilots found it harder to judge speed and angle during the split-second chaos of a dogfight. The evidence for these effects was not conclusive, but wartime conditions made clean measurements nearly impossible to gather. Several Luftwaffe units experimented with asymmetrical spiral variants and adjusted pattern widths to amplify the visual effect. These experiments showed that the Luftwaffe viewed even small psychological advantages as genuinely worth serious pursuit. The spiral also served a functional identification purpose within the disorienting chaos of fast-moving aerial combat. A fast-moving dogfight gave pilots only seconds to determine whether an approaching aircraft was friend or foe. Different Luftwaffe units varied the spiral width, color combinations, and angle of the pattern to create distinct unit markings. These differences were meaningful to trained eyes and helped pilots quickly identify friendly aircraft during intense engagements. The marking was never purely decorative. Every element of its design carried tactical operational information for the pilot. In the broader context of German wartime propaganda, the spiral quickly acquired a powerful life of its own. Nazi Germany invested heavily in projecting an image of technological supremacy, and the spiral reinforced that image powerfully. The Bf 109 or the Fw 190 nose, on with propeller spinning, made for striking, frightening propaganda imagery across all media. The spiral gave German fighters a predatory, mechanical ferocity in photographs and film footage, unlike any plane spinner could. It became part of the visual language through which the Luftwaffe chose to be seen, feared, and ultimately remembered. Not every German aircraft carried the pattern. Fighters wore it far more consistently than bombers or transport aircraft. Some aircraft, like the Junkers, Ju-88, occasionally featured spinner designs, but the practice was never universal across types. As the war turned against Germany, priority shifted to producing aircraft fast rather than finishing them with care or detail. Paint schemes became simpler and then disappeared altogether in some production runs as industrial capacity collapsed under bombing. By the final months of the war, some aircraft rolled out, wearing nothing but bare gray primer from the factory floor. The elaborate painted spiral became a quiet casualty of industrial collapse, vanishing from aircraft along with everything else. Despite that wartime collapse, the swirl survived in memory and museum collections long after the fighting had ended. Walk through any major aviation museum and Luftwaffe machines still announce themselves with that spinning mark on the spinner. The spiral is preserved on propellers that will never turn again, frozen in place as a permanent reminder of wartime design. The detail meant to intimidate, protect ground crews, and identify squadrons became one of aviation history's most enduring signatures. What began as paint carefully applied to spinning metal became something far larger, reaching far beyond its original wartime purpose. It became something close to mythology, a symbol that outlasted the Air Force that created it and the war that defined it.